What's up, boys? Definitely going to be doing this one in one take because I have a whole ass paper to write tonight. Uh, but I'm going to do one of these because I hit the number of questions I was waiting for before I did this one. As always, if you have any questions you would like my opinion on, put them in the comments of this video and I will get to them in the next one. And as far as the question I asked to lead off the last one about whether you guys would like to see me document my training on YouTube in addition to my Instagram, one or two of you said yeah, you'd be interested, and a follow-up question for you guys would be, what sessions would you like to see? Would a hypertrophy session be relatively boring as it's all kind of sub-maximal? Would like a strength block session, or would be like more of a peaking block where I'm hitting something actually heavy and somewhat impressive? Don't know what you guys want to see, so please let me know. The first question, aside from talking about documenting my training, was would love to see you do a warm-up and mobility video. Okay, so on the Team Spanaway page, I put a video up about how to design your own warm-up because I think that's a pretty individual process, and I think it might be up on my YouTube as well. If you haven't, I would highly recommend giving that a watch. Kind of breaks down like, okay, what is universal for everybody, what do we have to do to get warmed up, and then what would individual addition to that look like. I'm pretty minimalist when it comes to warming up. I think that's a lot of time in the gym that people waste that could be spent doing real training rather than these unnecessary, really low scale exercises that supposedly prep you for motion, when in reality we know the best way to warm up for something is with something specific to what you want to be doing at a low scale. So this way to warm up for squat is to take an empty bar or 95 pounds for a bunch of sets working on your technique until you meet that prerequisite of raising your core body temperature, right? So but that being said, I could definitely make a video kind of showing what that looks like in practical application. Who is your favorite lifter of all time? Big Z. Very close second would be either Milanichev or Dan Green, but Big Z is my favorite probably. If you see right there, I have an Andrei Milanichev autograph. How would you measure tonnage for programming? Do you include warm-up sets or accessory exercises into your total tonnage for calculations? What are your thoughts on deloads and how do you program them in? Do you only do them when you feel tired, overworked, or are they planned? All right, that's a great question. So I personally don't like total tonnage as a metric. It's kind of helpful to make sure you're progressing in some manner across time to calculate it, but I think that it can be very deceiving. Like, if you do German volume training, that's a great total tonnage, but I wouldn't say that's more effective than doing 5 sets of 10 with just slightly more weight. If anything, I would favor the 5x10. I think there's a lot of junk volume in German volume training for most people. So I don't like total tonnage. What I really like to look at is the number of working sets per week. So you asked, would I count warm-up sets in that? So it depends kind of where we define the threshold for a work set. I generally think that I start calling it a work set with 5 reps in reserve or less. So usually my last warm-up, if let's say I'm taking 5s all the way up, usually my last warm-up will be counted as one work set. But usually how I track tonnage, workload for powerlifting is the number of sets performed in a given general rep range. So you have your general peaking scheme of 1 to 3 reps during a peaking phase or during a peaking session. If you do daily undulating, how many work sets does that person need or like to do during a strength phase? Call it 4 to 6 range. How many work sets do you perform across the week per session, so on and so forth. And then hypertrophy, 8 plus, 7 plus. How many work sets are you performing across the week per session, so on and so forth. That's how I kind of do it myself. Thoughts on deloads? They're a part of training. How do I program them? I personally try to approach training by never intentionally exceeding my maximum recoverable volume or workload. Some people would use functional overreaching, so they'll ramp up across 3 weeks. 3rd week they're going above what they know they're going to be able to sustainably recover from, and then they take a deload to hope to get some sort of super compensation effect, right? Some sort of slingshot rebound. As you decay that fatigue, you're going to be carried to higher levels of strength than you are before. Perfectly valid strategy, not my preferred way. I like to coast, build gradually across the block from starting just like a reasonable bit below for that phase, working up to just below it, but never intentionally exceeding it. So when I program deloads or when I fuck up, and I accidentally dip past what I can sustainably recover from on a week-to-week basis. That's my personal preference. It has worked thus far. Any strong opinions concerning powerlifting feds? I got a lot less strong opinions about that than other people because I don't really compete. That being said, I think my opinion is that it comes down to the lifter to uphold the standard they see fit. If you're going to say, all right, I competed to the standard provided on the day, aka I know they were going to call everything loosely, so I squatted high. I mean, if you can acknowledge that, that's all right. Don't lie and say that it was good. Don't lie to yourself. But if you can acknowledge that, that's whatever. I would prefer everybody hold themselves to their a more literal interpretation of the rule book, because all depth is defined the same in all the rule books. So that shouldn't vary. So I think people should hold themselves to their own standards, and I think you can do quality lifting in a less strict fed, right? As long as the lifts were legit, that should speak for themselves, and the fed they were in shouldn't matter. So if someone goes and does like a SPF meet and dunks the shit out of their squat, that's a world record. I have no problem with it, right? No, the problem isn't the fed always; it's the lifters. And ideally, we should blame the refs. It's not the lifters' fault. I mean, it kind of is the lifters' fault. They're calling weights that they probably know they couldn't do to strict depth because they know the depth is dicey, or they've just been lying to themselves in training. So I'm more of a personal accountability type guy, so thus I don't really stress about the feds quite as much. That being said, I think USAPL is the go-to for highest level of competition, though I hope that USPA tested continues to grow. I just find they're a little bit more reasonable with how they treat their lifters, and I personally value that. And then as far as untested goes, USPA is the gold standard. WRPF puts on a lot of cool meets, but I don't think that the judging is as consistent. There are some shit USPA meets, but there are also shit local USAPL meets. So, one thing I've always told people is what matters a lot more than the fed is the meet promoter, right? You can see these perfectly run, amazing SPF meets, and you can see some dog shit USAPL meets. So, more so than anything, it's the specific meet. Yeah, those are my opinions, though I will say none of those are very strong. Assuming time isn't a limiting factor and volume is equated, does it make a difference if you do your day's workout all in one session versus splitting up into multiple sessions? For example, perhaps training one compound movement in the morning and then coming back later in the evening to do another compound movement or just do accessories. Okay, so on paper, splitting the volume into 2 sessions across your day is going to be better. You're basically going to be more well rested. You're going to have a slightly better performance in the secondary session than you would if you did it after the main session, directly after the main session. So on paper, better. So if you just took a regular training session, cut it in half, and then put it in the afternoon, you could refuel, you can refocus. So I'm going to tell you that on paper, that is better. That being said, there's no studies to validate that, and this is just my opinion based on my experience as someone who's tried 2-a-day training many, many times. I find that most people are going to get really banged up after 4 to 6 weeks, especially if you're going compound in the morning, compound in the evening. It's a really good way to potentially make some really solid progress for a while, but I don't think it's a sustainable training approach. I felt kind of happy because this was validated when Fouad Abiad kind of talked about how he's tried it. He feels he got great results from it, but he felt that after 4 or 5 week mark, it just you start to get too banged up, regardless of how well you warm up and how well you're recovering. I just don't think it's sustainable for most people. A slightly more sustainable approach is to do all of your compounds in the primary session and dedicate the secondary session to lower scale isolation exercises. I think you can sustain that a little bit longer, but I think the same problem emerges where even if volume's equated, it seems to be a little bit more taxing on your body, in my experience, and that that outweighs the benefits of the increased performance for the secondary session. I've tried it a bunch of times. I think that it can be really, really well implemented if you schedule it for 3 to 4 weeks. If you're just like, hey, I'm going to push a shit ton of food, I'm doing a hypertrophy phase, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break up my sessions, I'm going to put a bunch of volume in, on my bench and whatever in the primary session, and then I'm going to come back to the gym, or I'm going to use my home gym, and then I'm going to get all my arm volume in, my delt volume on smaller isolation stuff. If you're planning that for like a 3 to 4 week hypertrophy block, go for it. It can work super well. Just push through a lot of food, make sure you're sleeping. It can be extremely productive, right? So I'm not going to say it has no place. You just have to deliberately limit the amount of time you're spending on it. I wish I had learned that sooner, because I tried to force 2-a-day training for about 3 or 4 years, and it didn't yield better results. It just led to me being a little bit more banged up than I would be otherwise. The next one was, are rest times just as important for strength training as they are for muscle building? That's a very good question. I would say that they are less important. People have achieved very, very high levels of hypertrophy using very limited rest times, kind of relying a little bit more on metabolic techniques or metabolic drivers of hypertrophy. And some guys do rest for quite a while. A lot of the more notoriously strong bodybuilders will use rest times that look a little bit more like a powerlifter, whereas very few powerlifters are going to use these really low rest times, especially the whole block. Maybe during a hypertrophy phase, deliberately limiting your rest times could be a beneficial thing, but no one does it always, to my knowledge. So I would say, yeah, it's a little bit more important on the strength training sides of things. I think that you could do it both ways for hypertrophy. Do you believe there is a most optimal or best position to sleep in for spine health? Do you try to sleep in optimal positions, or just sleep however is most comfortable, puts you out the fastest? Okay, that's a really good question. I don't know if there's very much data to validate sleeping positions for spinal health. I know that some people say that sleeping on your stomach is really bad for your spine. I've heard it's just you're not going to be able to breathe as much, especially as you get bigger if you're lifting. So I usually recommend sleeping on your stomach, but I wouldn't say it's the worst thing in the world. I don't think it's as bad as some people deem it to be, but I try to avoid people sleeping on their stomach. I think sleeping on your side and sleeping on your back are pretty comparable. Generally speaking, kind of depends on the person, where as you get bigger and you get wider, sleeping on your side becomes a little bit more difficult, as I've found myself. I've always slept on my side because I sleep the best that way. But you got a couple things you're trying to juggle. Generally speaking, people are going to have a little bit, if you're prone to sleep apnea, it's going to be a little bit worse on your back, but I would recommend you resolve that by getting a CPAP, not by adjusting your sleep position. You do have to prioritize what puts you out the fastest and what leads to the best quality sleep, because maybe if something's slightly suboptimal, but you're sleeping that much better, that's going to outweigh whatever negatives are associated with that. So that's something else I would factor in. And then just trial and error. I don't know of any literature to definitively prove one thing over the other. I notice that when I do manage to fall asleep on my back, I seem to feel a little bit better the next day than I do when I sleep on my side. I know Brian Shaw has talked about how he deliberately transitioned to sleeping on his back, and he feel that helped him a lot. But it's pretty person to person. I know like plenty of people who perform at a very high level with no discomfort who sleep on their side. If you want to say I'm high level, I would fall into that category, because as much as I try to sleep on my back, I usually end up on my side. Do you have any opinion on the NSCA-CPT exam/certification? I'm looking to get certified, but I am not sure if I should go for an American thing or something of my own country. Okay, so that's a really good question. I am not familiar with the one you mentioned for your own country. So that's going to be my big caveat to my answer. Most American certifications, it's more so proving that you're dedicated enough to go get it. It's a baseline. It doesn't really help you practically do your job. I don't think most of the information is all that helpful. You're not talking about like the basics of program design or progressive overload. It's more so like beginner exercise physiology, just proving that you're not dumb. That being said, you have to think about, okay, what is the goal of going to get it? If the goal is just to get hired, that depends on what the gyms near you ask for. So I would base it based on that. If the goal is to expand your knowledge, I can't speak for the other one, but I might not necessarily recommend the American certification if the goal is just to learn and do better at the job. If it's to get hired, that just depends on the local gyms. If it's to learn, I might not do either. If you can get a job without either, I might look into learning through other avenues. I just don't think most of the certifications that I've looked at or gotten are all that valuable. And then the last question. I'm starting to have a sharp pain in my... Oh, man, there's a whole conversation under this. I won't read the conversation. I'll just read the question. I'm starting to have sharp pain in my upper chest, right next to my shoulder from benching. Should I take a week off of benching or completely or just deload? I feel my form is good. I keep feeling it even with light weight. That's a good question, man. I'm not qualified to give medical advice, A. And B, I don't know. I haven't seen you bench, so I don't know how technically proficient you are. I don't know if you're making some like little error where your form is like overall good, but like just some small thing is leading to some discomfort. So I can't really give you a recommendation. If it goes away just by deloading, I would deload. If you need to take some time off completely, be it brief, I would take time off. So I would go with the most aggressive thing that's going to get the job done. So the least you can back off and let it heal is going to be the best option in my opinion. Sorry I couldn't give you a better answer on that one.